Okay, good. Yeah, heard lots and lots about FuseBox. Everything's happening here, so great to be here, and thank you for the invitation. So, we're going to talk, I hope you're not too long, and then we're going to try and show you demos, and in particular our two new Mutator VR experiences, Vortex and Mutation Space. Last week we were showing those in a big exhibition in Shanghai, and so apologies if Lance and I are a bit jet lagged. We're still coming to after all the karaoke and all the huge meals we had. But anyway, so we're going to talk about the history of the work, and in particular some of the technology that we've been using, and then we're going to come at the end talk a bit about some of the scientific visualization work, where scientists have looked at our Mutator VR engine and said, well, can you adapt it to model and visualize DNA and RNA, for example. So we're going to try and tell that full story. What I'm not going to talk about is all the work I've done in the games industry. I'm not going to talk about the work that I did in rave music. Though interestingly, Lance and I are working on a really interesting project combining music and VR, which is top secret under wraps. So looks like we will be doing stuff for the music industry. Yes, finally. So Lawrence and I collaborate on Mutator VR, and I guess the key thing is everything we do is a team effort. So I'm the lead artist, but Stephen Todd, who I worked with in the late 80s at IBM, I'm still collaborating with, and also his son, Peter Todd, is one of the programming team. In addition to that, we have a number of other people that help us with exhibition installation and all practical stuff that we have to do. So I guess the crux of the work has always been combining sort of ideas about evolutionary art and sort of how you create original content, but underpinning that with some really serious software engineering. So everything we write for our experiences are written directly in C++ in general. Though Stephen likes to use a weird hybrid of JavaScript and other languages. But we don't use Unreal or Unity or anything like that. And we can touch on that, the reason why we don't do that later on. So everything we do is proprietary, and by that method we can customize the experience to exactly what we want. Let me try and move forward a bit. So the work has this long history back to 1988, where this is Stephen Todd and I working at IBM in Winchester, and what this photo doesn't show is the large room of mainframe computers that were on the floor below, and a huge room full of computers that would be probably about the equivalent to a top-end PC with a decent graphics card now. And this was one of our mutations from that period, which was ray traced, and that took about 3 or 4 hours to render. So this kind of long legacy, in fact, some of the algorithms we developed back in IBM we're still using now in our technology. So just moving forward, this is one of, so is that too bright, the image, or can we tilt it in the lights a little bit more? So this is what the viewer encounters in VR. This obviously is dynamically moving. It's like a giant orchid that opens up and surrounds you. And then within a few seconds, it's metamorphosed and mutated into another different type of form. So on the top here, we see the scene probably about 30 seconds later, and that's what it looks like below. But every time the viewer uses our experience, it's a unique experience. So we're randomly seeding the geometry with random numbers, but we're also capturing the positions of the controllers to influence the content, which I'll get onto in a bit. So these are other screenshots. Another snapshot. This kind of Geiger-esque, surrealist space that we put the viewer in, and we try and make it as immersive as possible. So the sense is that they've left this reality and gone into an alternative reality. Another shot with this is a version that we produced for shown in Kyoto. We showed it in Mutator VR in this 500-year-old Buddhist temple, and it was a great juxtaposition between Buddhist culture, ancient culture, and modern technology. Again, another screenshot. And the idea is that by kind of harnessing all this procedural geometry, you can create dynamically new evolutionary worlds around the viewer. And in particular, what we've been doing recently is putting the forms and the viewers in like a mirrored space, like the walls are all mirrored, so you get these kind of multiple reflections. This compares slightly to the earlier work in the 80s where the forms were always on black, like in a black void. So this was where we showed it in Venice. Venice again. What we tend to do is always show the in VR view on screens on the wall, ideally as large as possible. One of the big problems with VR, as everyone in this room knows, is just having the throughput of the number of people, even if you've got 4 devices. So definitely having the visuals on the wall, what the person's seeing, you get this secondary audience whilst they're waiting. This is where we did show Mutator VR in a big rave. It was the anniversary of Danny Rampling's Shoom, and all these aging ravers came back, had a big party, and we had lots of people in Mutator VR dancing, and they were either under the influence of ecstasy or they were saying, well, it's a bit like an ecstasy experience being in Mutator VR, so the ones that were on ecstasy were kind of getting a double whammy. But what they were doing, it was great, people dancing, they're really getting into it. So what's interesting with this work is you have this kind of broad audience. Children seem to like it, as well as adults. These are just some of the places that we've shown it in St. Petersburg. In fact, we're going to be again there in November. Sort of not really the art world, not really the science world. We're sort of in that twilight world, but certainly the numbers you get when you're showing VR can be really, really good in these sort of venues. This is just some of the history of the way. I need to keep going, otherwise I'm going to overrun time. But the early work at IBM was inspired by the early evolutionary drawings that I did. And these were rule-based drawings where at the top of the drawing would be a geometric primitive, like a cone or a sphere, and there would be a number of transforms that would generate all these variants. And so this was the kind of blueprint that I took to IBM, where I became a research fellow, that the evolutionary approach sort of was inspired by. When we turned it into software, the rules did change, and that's always the challenge as you move between mediums, but the philosophy was that using simple generative rules, you should be able to generate really, really interesting results after a few generations. And I was spending a lot of time in the Natural History Museum looking at natural forms. The idea is whether you could have a man-made evolutionary system that could compete with nature's creativity. And these are some of the drawings. So this was, by this point I was starting to try to formalize the approach. I'm not going to talk too much about this. So by that point I'd become a research fellow at IBM. And what happened was that I immediately had access to compute power. I went from art school to being in a corporation. They had a solid modeling system that could be used for a range of graphical effects, such as, in fact, molecular graphics, ironically. And they had a CSG modeler, which was very nice in that it was not polygonally based. It would just keep subdividing the scene endlessly using a kind of octree division approach. And so again, they had a kind of proprietary engine that I had access to. And using these primitives, you could union them together or difference them. So what we then started to do was use this evolutionary approach, produce a list of what we call transforms, and quite quickly using these very long lists of transforms, which took parameters, obviously, we could start to create forms that started to look more organic. So if you had, so the idea was this was kind of grammar with a horn grammar, and you could have horn of horns, you could append them together, web of horns. So just once we'd designed this grammar, there seemed to be an endless variety of different types of forms that one could create, including very elegant, simple forms. And so it was a bit like Pandora's box. As soon as we got the grammar right and crafted it, in general, really interesting visual forms would come out of it. Obviously, we use some nice lighting, nice surface qualities, etc. And the idea was that these forms would look natural and unnatural at the same time. Then what we did was we, partly inspired by Dawkins' biomorph system, we sort of took these long lists of parameters and put them in kind of evolutionary fruit machine to automatically generate variants. And so what then happens is you start to build these evolutionary trees where with each generation you pick the one that's most aesthetic and then read again. And these were some of the forms that were we produced around that time. So the idea was the artist becomes like a gardener, just we would. So this is one variant from about 100 generations down the evolutionary tree, and this is a form that I particularly liked. So the idea is anyone who really like would lift out, render up, and then show in exhibitions. The one on the right had a very high level of randomness. So the idea was a kind of evolution by aesthetics. And I guess one of the interesting things about this is that with traditional art gallery situation, the viewer and the content are separated. You have this idea of you're receiving content from the art, whereas in VR we place the viewer in the picture. I think that's a big. Sorry. And that's one of the big differences. And that's what's really exciting about VR is the viewer becomes part of the content and influences the content. Okay, we're back. So the idea here is that once exploring a multi-dimensional space of possibilities, it can be absolutely huge. And creatives have this problem the whole time. As you're a mixing desk with 100 sliders, how do you find the best one within all those millions of variants? So the idea was that Mutator would enable you to kind of traverse this multi-dimensional space of possibilities and find the good stuff. And what's interesting about the space is that you get patches of really boring stuff, and then suddenly you get like a vein of really good content. So jumping forward quite a few years, I don't know how many, last 15 plus, maybe longer, Stephen had finished doing all the transaction processing work that he'd been doing at IBM, and we started Mutator VR again. So we produced two experiences, mutation space and Vortex. Lance leads on Vortex, and he's going to talk about that specifically. But what we did was we just went back to the original code. Unfortunately, we couldn't find the original code because it had all been stored on magnetic disks. But thankfully, we'd written a book, Evolutionary on Computers. And actually, we went to the book that we'd wrote to remind ourselves which algorithms we'd written in the first place. So, yeah, it's a big plus for academia, but it did remind us how vulnerable code is. How, I think it's a problem everyone has, is how you're going to keep your code live moving forward. As formats change, devices change, etc. So basically, we took the same grammar, we really implemented a kind of breeding system. This was the core multi-dimensional structure that we used, and then we then thought a little bit about the controllers. So we mainly work on Vive, mainly because the visual quality is really good. And my personal feeling, the big challenge with VR is actually user interaction. How do you make it intuitive for the person in VR to have a good experience by using a limited number of buttons? You don't want to bring up menus like Tilt Brush does and things like that. And so when we're working, we're often revising the mapping of the functionality to the controllers. So for the mutation space, it's quite a rich environment. So we have to think about how we map each of those problems. So, some of them are quite tricky, actually. Hold the object and move the object. It's quite tricky because people can hide objects and then they can't find them again. Anyway, so functionality is really important. But one of the things that we did pretty quickly was link the X, Y, Z positions and the rotation, like direction of the controllers to the structure. So if the person goes like that, the world around them is influenced by that very movement. So the smallest movement they make impacts the total environment that they're in and the form in front of them. And that is a very, very strong cue for a sense of immersion. And it's a simple trick, but because we've got all these parameters. Now what's interesting is that we've got 300 parameters which describe this form, and in general, I think when we're taking the controllers, we're mapping about 12 parameters we can get. But what's interesting is that the viewer normally works out how to control that form, even though they don't understand the mapping. Intuitively, they kind of know what's happening. So here you can see on the right-hand side, you can try this later, the scene changes. Other tricks we've found from our point of view, lighting is really important in VR. And what we do is, this is our viewer, we give them a miner's lamp, and we give them a torch. And actually, a bit like George Delatour's painting, if the viewer moves in VR, the shadows move accordingly based on their light position. And that, again, that's a really strong visual cue, because everyone understands that. Everyone's walked around at night holding a torch, you immediately get it. One of the other challenges with Mutator VR is we're creating lots and lots of content. It's a little bit like being in the Amazonian jungle, with these strange mutated forms. And actually, what we have to do is we have to put a Boolean cutter around the person's head and their hand so that we can guarantee that they can see stuff. We just don't have huge clipping problems. And that's one of the problems with procedural content. It can produce too much content. On the other, that's one of the challenges. So a Boolean cutter helps with that. But you have quite a nice effect where things pass through the cutter. So it's like you're carving out space. Pass over to Lance to talk about Vortex specifically. Okay.
So maybe I'll introduce myself very quickly. So I've been a researcher at Goldsmiths for the past 3 years, mainly looking at sort of creative uses of virtual reality and upcoming technologies, new display technologies, basically. So I've always had a strong interest in both art and science simultaneously. I have a bachelor's in electrical engineering, and then I went further on to get a master's in electronic music and sound design, and then a PhD in media arts and technology. So kind of started out very broad, narrowed myself down within broaden out again. So I think originally how I got into sort of computer arts is through music. I was very interested in using the computer to generate music on its own. But as I progressed, I started getting more interested in sort of graphics and how to visualize audio. And currently, I'm thinking more about what sort of ties these two modalities together. There isn't really an answer for that, but my hunch is it's some geometric structures. And I think this is where I find William and Stephen's work very interesting, kind of this exploration of computer grammars in order to generate forms. So I knew about William's work for a long time, but Vortex is using a slightly different approach to the generation of forms, and it's kind of based on my interests in sound and trying to find sort of a relationship between sound and visual form. So just to start with some screenshots of the work. So very similar to the Mutator work or organic form work that William and Stephen were doing. A lot of the shapes are based on the principle of curves and sort of applying the same geometric transformation over and over again to kind of generate a shape of some sort. So in this experience, everything in the world is basically a curve. And for me, it's interesting because it ties right back into audio. If you think of audio waveforms and you say plot it on a piece of paper, it's actually a curve of some kind. But if you look a little bit deeper into it, there's a certain topological structure to what makes a sound good. And like the simplest thing is that if it's periodic, it'll make a harmonic tone, which is sort of the basis of music. So for this experience, basically we have little creatures that swim around, and those are following a particle system. But what we do is render a curve around the particle to kind of make it a bit more organic and make it seem like an actual living entity of some kind. It really isn't, but I think one of the interesting things about working in VR is trying to figure out how to best fake it, because we don't actually know how nature works. I mean, reality, if you're looking at all the new display technologies coming out, the word reality is in all of them. That's the thing across them. So thinking about what is reality and what is nature, I think that sort of needs to come into play. And these all deal with the sense of immersion the user is going to get in the space. Just another screenshot. I think I'll just explain it. So basically, Vortex is based on a particle system, but it's an interactive particle system. So the very first experiments I was doing in VR were just sort of having these particle clouds and then using your hands or the controllers to manipulate those particle clouds. And I think many people will try this experiment at some point. But then I started wondering, can you actually create sort of a micro world where there are sort of agents in the space that can give you a sense of them responding to you and being embedded within some environment. So basically that particle system, we turned it into, modified it a little bit so that the way that the particles moved would be a bit more organic looking. So instead of just accelerating all the time, they could have some friction forces, slow down when they approach you, and things like that add a lot to the sort of realism that it's an actual entity that's responding to you, the user, which is an important part of virtual environments, that the user gets a sense that they're a part of the actual environment they're in. Sorry, the image didn't show up, but basically this slide should cover it. So we wanted to sort of have control over how the agents flow in the space. So probably a popular approach is to use sort of fluid dynamics. However, those equations can get rather complex. Whether that's good or bad, that's a matter of opinion. But we wanted to have full control over the sort of flow patterns in space. So we invented this technique where you have point sources, and around each point is a particular type of flow. So things can move towards the point, move away from the point, or circle around it. And these are actually, if you look at the math of fluid dynamics, these are sort of embedded in that mathematical framework. So we just pulled out the simple parts, gave us something we could work with. One of the interesting things we were able to do then is actually combine sort of autonomous flow of the agents along with the user interactions. So it gave us a unified framework in order to specify the dynamics of the environment. So basically on the bottom is showing what happens when there's a user in the space and they're interacting with the world. So on the left, sorry the images are a bit small, but there are these brown triangles you see all over. Those are agents that are flowing in space. So what we have kind of two different layers to the flows in the space. The first layer is environmental, so that's just the environment itself. It has different flow patterns, and that's kind of the non-interactive part. It just happens on its own. So that means if we put agents in the space, they're just going to swim around on their own. That's the autonomous agent part. So as we move to the right, the user holds the trigger down, and when they press the trigger, that's the image of the shape on the bottom, the black kind of oval shape. They actually create a new flow in the space. So that gets added into what's currently there. And you can see as we move from left to right, the agents will start flowing towards where the user interaction is taking place. So it's a kind of a nice, elegant way to just have one framework to work with all the dynamics. And so the other sort of component of this was how to actually generate forms. So not unlike the form grammar that William and Stephen invented, for this experience, we're using actual a different mathematical framework to do that, which is very closely tied to audio. And if anyone's interested in that, I can probably go into more detail afterwards. But using that framework kind of gives us a nice way to generate closed shapes. So with this technique, we can create the whole entity all at once. There aren't separate parts to it. It's just a few numbers and it generates the whole shape all at once, which is really nice because there are far fewer parameters. And I think one of the great things about computation is that it lets us do anything, but that's also sort of a negative. And I think in order to get past these huge parameter spaces and try to attack that problem of having too many things to work with, we need to come up with some meaningful constraints to the systems. So this is sort of a exploration of having a much more highly constrained mathematical framework to work with that hopefully leads us into some more interesting areas of generating shapes. And we can understand actually what we're doing. So the bodies are actually one curve, and we added these sort of hair-like filaments to them just to give a little bit more realism. Like if you look at creatures under a microscope, you'll see they have little hairs on them or things protruding. So we actually have another curve that generates those. In order to make them seem like they're individual curves, what we do on the right there, you can see we have the complete curve, but then at a certain radius away from its center, we snip it. So we remove the parts outside, and then that creates these like individual curves. So it's one curve, but then we just apply a trick to make it seem like it's multiple curves. So there's really one equation for that. So that was the artwork, and then we've also adapted it to sort of a scientific pedagogical experience. So this was done in collaboration with the Francis Crick Institute in London. They had a program where they would get scientists and artists together to talk about their work and then come up with some installation for the public to experience. So we showed them Mutator VR, and they were pretty amazed how closely it looked to some of the things they're looking at in the microscope. So this is why I've always been interested in art and science together, because there's tends to be a connection between them. So we worked with a few scientists, Esther Worshoff, Dr. Carl Bates, Dr. Eric Sahai. They're all working in the area of cancer, and specifically how cancer moves through the body. And they're working with an interesting theory where the cancer cells signal healthy cells to create filaments, actual strands of cells that the cancer cells can then sort of walk along. Cells generally just kind of flow, so they're kind of submitted to whatever fluid dynamics are in the body. But by doing this, they're using white blood cells to actually create sort of railroad tracks that they can move along, and then they can move away from the site of the tumor, and that's basically when it becomes a big problem. Yeah. Yeah. So these are just some of the images. You can see the filaments here, so you can kind of see a connection with some of the artwork we've been doing. On the right are the actual white blood cells, fibroblasts. And that's a blank slide. There should be a screenshot of the actual VR experience. But basically, we adapted Vortex. We modified some of the shapes and locations to represent a tumor environment with blood cells and cancer cells flowing. And what the user could do is interrupt that signaling process that changed the behaviors of the white blood cells. And so we showed it at the Francis Crick Institute. We did a late event, and then they asked us to come back to do a discovery day event where families came in on the weekend, and people seemed to really enjoy it. We had the scientists around to kind of talk about the science behind everything, and we were there to kind of explain what they were actually doing. So it was a great event. This is just a technical slide. So we're experimenting with a lot of different software technologies at the same time, using JavaScript and sort of WebGL to explore the browser space, which is very attractive because you can deploy your work anywhere in theory. But we're also looking at the more standard approach, which is just using C++, OpenGL, some of the more basic libraries. And a lot of our code is custom built anyway, so we tend to write a lot of stuff on our own anyway, so we don't need much other sort of utilities in order to get our work done.
Okay, so I'm going to try and get through these slides quickly so we have some questions. So what's been interesting is we've been approached by, as I mentioned, several scientific groups to adapt our Mutator VR engine for specific scientific work. And most of these projects started off as an outreach project, so a lot of scientific groups are impressions to do outreach, but actually with each of them, they've now turned into serious scientific projects. So this was, very, very briefly said, this is where we've adapted our Mutator VR engine to model the dynamics around DNA and RNA with the Weatherall Institute of Molecular Medicine. I'm not going to say much, because just to give a glimpse, this is work we've done with the virus group at York University. So I can't remember which virus this is. It may be influenza, but what we do is we can put the scientist inside the center of a virus about the size of this room, and we can show them things that they didn't know about the viruses, like heat pockets where the hot areas inside the virus are. But also what we're really helping them with is where the shell of the virus which is extremely beautiful, 60-fold symmetry, connects with the RNA or DNA in some variants, so there's these connection points. And so we're helping them tackle that problem. So, and this was presented at the Royal Society. So our team of core creative people has now been expanded with experts in scientific fields. And so this is the work we'll be doing with virus geometry. Ironically, the form grow grammar at a molecular level has some similarity to the kind of logic, the way viruses are put together, and also DNA and RNA. So actually the fundamental grammar has some similarity, and that's what we've been able to quite quickly adapt to get results for viruses and RNA and DNA. And so this is the user interface that we produce, and this is what the virus expert uses to explore what they're interested in is the way viruses mutate, and that's a big problem if you have an influenza epidemic. So this is the pipeline that we've built. So top right, we have our nice Mutator VR engine that's been used to produce lots of art over the years. But what we've done is we've built that into their pipeline. So we take viruses from their standard database or the protein data bank. We take some high-C data, which is really around the dynamics, and we pull that all together. We also handle the user interface for the scientists, and then bottom right shows what that enables the scientists to do. And then so these are other screenshots of again, this is the Mutator VR engine adapted to science. So when we're using Mutator VR for science, we call it MVR as an abbreviation. And that's another shot. So this project is moving extremely quickly now. Other shots. And then we've also used the engine for archaeological research, which I won't talk about. I'll talk about that another later talk. So yeah, just very quickly, general thoughts on VR. I think the key thing is the interaction needs to be intuitive. If the viewer wants to go back in time, they need to do that without even thinking about it. We have quite high problems in terms of high frequency textures. So if you've got procedural stuff changing the scale, you can get quite fizzy textures. And so we have building constraints to make sure that the whole scene doesn't look like a sea of bees, just got these tiny. We also have a chance because with rapid auto scaling, if something's huge and then it's got like half a second to be tiny, you get jumps. In the science world, people want to mark things up, so the idea of post-its in VR is really important. We have avoided the seasickness problem, but we do have slight problems where someone's rotating the controller and the entire world is rotating around them. Yeah, which is, and so again, that's a UI problem. And I think one of the challenges we find with the science work is where does the simulation stop? Do you simulate everything? So that's really important when you're working with scientists, is to work out where the model stops. And I think machine learning and image training has a lot of potential in VR, particularly where you're taking snapshots, particularly in the scientific domain. That's the end of the talk. I know we've run over a bit. But we're happy to answer any questions or have discussion.
Thank you, William. Thank you, Lance. That was really, really interesting. We definitely have some time for